if you're in the culture that we have, where people have highly inflamed narcissistic traits, probably 30-40% of the population and 30-40% of your interactions will be heavily marked by the imprint of narcissism.
You're in a relationship with a narcissist, it's not going well. Can you fix them? Can you help them? Or is that just
Yes, just
enabling?
Love them more, give them more, do whatever they say, and things will get better in a couple of weeks.
Do not try this at home.
So more and more of our problems and more of our issues in society are viewed through a psychological lens, because people get a kick out of pretending to be psychiatrists, basically.
Do you think that's a good thing? Or do you
No,
think
I
it's
don't.
damaging?
I think it's a dreadful thing.
Why?
Welcome to the Heartbreak to Happiness show with Sara Davidson. If you're struggling with a breakup and you feel shocked, angry, betrayed, devastated, or sad and alone, then this podcast is for you. Best-selling author and award-winning host Sara Davidson shares how you too can get on with your life to heal, grow, and move from heartbreak to happiness. Here's your host, Sara Davidson.
Welcome back to the show. Now, today's episode is sponsored by Hunters, who are a firm of solicitors in central London, specialising in all aspects of family law, because having a supportive family law team by your side makes all the difference when you're navigating a really tough divorce. You can contact them by emailing olivia.piercy@hunterslaw.com and quoting Sara Davidson. And I am super excited to welcome Richard Grannon to the show. Welcome back, Richard.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Richard, you're obviously a world-leading expert on narcissism.
Oh, how wonderful. Lucky me.
I know. And you've written a book as well,
Yes.
Cult of One.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just speaking at your event at the weekend as well.
Up in Liverpool, yeah.
Up in Liverpool. Now, you can say the name of the event because I struggle with pronouncing it.
Narcissistic Psychopathy.
That's the
Global
one.
Dark Force was the name of the event.
Yes, a huge success.
It went well, yeah, it was good. It was really good.
Yeah. So I'm super excited. We've spoken before many times on this topic. I find, obviously, your take really fascinating. You come from a slightly different angle to me. So I think this is going to be a great episode for people listening to dive into what is narcissism and how does it work. So I've got lots of questions.
Cool.
Maybe we'll start with, what is a narcissist?
So if somebody has narcissistic personality disorder, that's a different thing to being very high in trait narcissism. So a lot of people in our culture are developing highly narcissistic traits. But that's different to having full-blown narcissistic personality disorder. If you have full-blown narcissistic personality disorder, it's really a deeply held attachment to a grandiose delusional vision of yourself that you've developed in childhood, and a grandiose delusional vision of who you are in reality. But essentially you believe that you are very unique, you're very special, and that everything is all about you all the time.
And we don't just come across them in romantic relationships. I mean, they could be anywhere in your life, right?
Yeah, it could be your boss, it could be your mother, could be family members, could be friends. They reckon 1 to 5% of the population probably has narcissistic personality disorder, comorbid psychopathy. So, yeah, it's a good number of people that you can run into. Plus, as I say, if you're in the culture that we have, where people have highly inflamed narcissistic traits, probably 30-40% of the population and 30-40% of your interactions will be heavily marked by the imprint of narcissism.
So you were saying there about, I mean, obviously this is everywhere. So I think it's important to recognise that it's not just people we get into relationships with, though that's really where I want to focus for today. But you were talking there about it, where does it come from? Like, are you born with it? Or is it something that can get worse over time? Is it something that you would know straight away?
Well, you can't diagnose a human with narcissistic personality disorder in most countries in the world before the age of 18. Probably it's childhood trauma that's doing it, but as we heard from Professor Ed Dutton over the weekend, there could be as much as 50% heritability in it. That doesn't mean that because you've inherited the genes that it's necessarily going to express itself, but there is a heritability factor that we have to look at. Largely speaking, it's a child who's raised in an environment where they're receiving very contrary pieces of information about themselves and their place in the world that drives the child into a split. So they have a split view of themselves and a split view of reality. The two conflicting messages, broadly speaking, are you are amazing and wonderful and special, typically when you perform in a way that mommy and daddy likes, and also you are worthless and useless and evil. And so the child grows up with these two, we call them superego injunctions, these two voices, these two impulses inside of themselves that are conflicting, saying you're amazing and special and deserve special treatment, which leads to high levels of entitlement and a lack of empathy, and also you're awful and terrible and wicked and evil, which drives their anxiety, and then that makes them paranoid and hyper-competitive, and we have this concept in psychology called ideas of reference, where you think completely incidental events or occurrences or conversations are all about you. They all refer to you negatively. So you think you're the victim of a conspiracy all the time.
Mm. And I mean, these traits, you talked a little bit there about how you would recognise, but I mean, first of all, looking at the childhood thing, the reason we don't diagnose under 18 is because, well, children are narcissistic in a way because they're sort of learning about life and everything revolves around them.
Yes, you should go through periods of quite high trait narcissism as you develop, especially if you're a toddler.
Yeah.
Because you are the centre of the world. You have no idea of other people's feelings and other people's desires and fears. You have to learn that empathy over time.
Yeah. And so when they get to 18, then you should be able to sort of distinguish whether that is or isn't. I mean, I'm not a big one for labels. Do you think labelling it actually helps?
There's nothing I've seen that indicates that labelling it particularly helps, because there's not much we can do for it therapeutically, either with drugs or with talk therapy. It's very resistant to therapeutic intervention.
Yeah.
You could say it's the antithesis of therapeutic intervention, to the extent therapeutic intervention depends heavily on truthfulness, authenticity, and vulnerability, and the receiving with humility of negative feedback. Your therapist is going to tell you what you can't see and what you're maybe making mistakes with, and the whole personality disorder is sort of structured to avoid all of that. So yeah, it's pretty therapy resilient.
Yeah, that explains a lot.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about the traits then. So what sort of traits would identify someone as a narcissist?
Interpersonally exploitative.
Meaning?
They don't do adult-to-adult horizontal interaction. Their idea of fair and equal is vertical, them on top and you underneath. Yeah, so their idea of equal is skewed. They don't do adult fair and equitable trading and transactions. They do it from a position of superiority downward. So they're very, very hierarchy focused, which is where the hyper-competitiveness comes in. And that sense of their place in the hierarchy being threatened is very, very sensitive. I don't know if you were there in the seminar where I was role-playing with a Canadian woman, and I was pretending to be a narcissist, and she was saying to me, why do you cling on to conflict? And as a narcissist, when I was role-playing it, I was like, how dare you suggest that I'm not completely in control of this interaction? Who the hell do you think you are? You're in my world, I'm not in yours. So that's a very sort of top-down way of looking at life. They're tyrants, effectively.
Yeah. In fact, she went straight into victim mode, and I almost got up and gave her a hug. I
triggered her into a massive emotional flashback, which was not very sensitive.
Well, yeah, it was an interesting demonstration for everybody, though. I think,
yeah, she suffered so that others could learn. That was her sacrifice. No, I did have a chat with her, and I did say to her, there's things that need to be looked at in therapy here, because she had a fairly hard childhood.
Yeah. I spoke to her as well. She was a sweetheart and obviously in the right place trying to learn about it, which is, I think, one of the most important foundations is to get that clarity. But let's just go back. So the authority thing is interesting to me because in my experience of them, the police, the law, obviously that for most people would then be above them. So how does that fit into that hierarchy you're talking about where they're at the top and everyone else is below them?
Well, they'll just go into denial if the police or the law or a judge says this is what you have to do. They'll just say, well, no, I don't have to do that. Yes, you do. Otherwise, we're going to put you in prison. No, you won't. And then you put them in prison and they go, you're in prison now. And they go, no, I'm not.
Extreme denial.
Yeah, it's my sister's ex-husband is like that. And then he's been in jail about 35 times because he just lives in denial. They keep saying to him, you must obey the law. And he goes, no, I don't.
And they don't learn from that.
Well, I mean, there's obviously, there's different types. There's an IQ factor. There's a psychopathy factor. So if they're highly psychopathic, they really don't care because they're criminals at heart. If they're a little bit more vain and a bit more reputation focused, then yes, they would want to avoid being jailed. They would find that humiliating. Some narcissists who are, it's a highly comorbid personality disorder. It's very rare for somebody to just get the clinical diagnosis of narcissism. They usually almost always get narcissism plus some other comorbidity. One of the high ones is psychopathy.
So for the layman, what does that mean?
It means that they're not just a narcissist. They've usually got other mental health issues as well.
No, I get that bit, but like, what does that mean, the morbidity part? What does that mean?
They're comorbid. So a comorbidity means you've got another illness alongside the first.
It always happens, by the way. I have to sort of translate.
For
me, not for even my audience. You probably get it.
Yeah. We haven't even gotten into the psychoanalytic theory. Like, some of the language is difficult. It is very, very difficult.
Yeah.
So it just means you're sick with two things.
So bipolar and narcissism, do they often go hand in hand?
That's a controversial question because there's published research that indicates that bipolar is actually could frequently be misdiagnosed narcissistic personality disorder and vice versa. Because in bipolar you have manic and depressive states, which match up with narcissistic elation and narcissistic depletion. And so, unfortunately, it's all very primitive. It's not very advanced. Like, the diagnostic criteria are pretty crap. The ones from the DSM and the ICD-10, it's basically a shopping list of annoying things that narcissists do. Okay. Here's 9 annoying things. Like, we dealt with one being interpersonally exploitative. The other one we dealt with was being entitled. That's an observation that we make outside of their reality.
Yeah.
There's no description to say, well, internally what they're... It's not there in the diagnostic criteria. Right. So, of course, clinicians make mistakes, and also clinicians often get what they're looking for: affirmation bias, confirmation bias. Yeah. I'm a bipolar expert. You're high and you spent all this money and you maxed your credit cards out and then you got very depressed. I think you have bipolar because I see the world through a bipolar diagnostic lens, and I wasn't aware. So I've spoken to multiple psychiatrists about some of the stuff I talk about on YouTube, and they'll tell me to my face, I've never heard this before. I've never been taught this. I've not been taught any of this. They claim. Now, whether they were or they weren't, because obviously they're taking on a huge amount of information, because they're obviously psychiatry, they're full medical doctors, and then they do their psychiatric training as well. There isn't an emphasis on this. There's no emphasis whatsoever. There's a girl I met in London, actually, at a speed dating event. We were just talking about dating before.
Yeah.
Back in 2015, and she'd just come through her training. And took her for a drink afterwards, and it ended up becoming a therapy session because she didn't understand narcissism. She didn't understand secondhand trauma. And yeah, she just said, I was not taught any of this. And I'm like, I'm just a taxi driver who runs a YouTube channel. And I had to sit there and teach her about this so that she could go back and finish her internship.
Let's talk about how you got into this, because it is, I mean, the number of conversations we've had where you've said you're getting out of it and years later you're still in it, which is great, because I think a lot of people need the sort of thing you talk about. But
they are made up for them that they need me to stay here.
Well, you're adding massive value out in the world, I think, talking about things and going to places that a lot of people don't don't
Yeah.
go. So, you know, it's valuable.
Yeah.
You know, I guess it wasn't your childhood dream to specialise in
No.
this niche. So
No.
tell us how you got into it.
My childhood dream was to be Kwang Shai Kane from Kung Fu and walk across the land beating up bad guys. Yeah. Do you remember Kung Fu?
I do remember Kung Fu.
Yeah, I loved him. He was great.
Yeah.
That was my childhood dream. I sort of fulfilled that when I was teaching self-defense.
I was gonna say, you
doing
did-
Street Fight
yeah.
Secrets. I also wanted to be a stuntman. There was a lesser-known series that you probably won't remember that was just called The Stuntman. No, it's really, really old. Why did I get into this? So when I was teaching self-defense, did that for about 10 years. And my angle with self-defense was always very much bringing the psychology to self-defense. I have a degree in psychology, for what it's worth. And the people in the self-defense community really like that. And so I ended up becoming like an instructor's instructor because nobody, or very few people, like I could name on one hand, all of the guys who are combining neurolinguistic programming, which you know a lot about.
Yeah.
I was trained under Paul McKenna.
Me too.
You're trained
Yeah,
by
by
him.
Paul. Yeah.
Do you
And Richard.
And Richard Bandler.
Yeah.
So you did the same trainings
Yeah.
and the Bandler McKenna trainings. How long ago did you do yours?
I mean, it's like nearly 25 years ago.
Okay. So,
Maybe more.
So
Wow,
then
28
was there a
years ago?
third guy with them, an American guy?
He came after I trained because it was just
okay.
Richard and Paul at the beginning.
And then there was another guy called whatever.
Oh, there's Michael Breen.
Breen.
Yes,
Michael
so I
Breen.
trained with him as well.
Yeah, I did too, yeah.
So
yeah.
we must have maybe even been in the same room.
Possibly, because
Yeah.
he was here in London.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was 18.
I don't know.
Don't reveal nothing about your age now.
No, we're not going there.
No, I was 18.
I think we're the same age.
I can tell you when. It was
No,
1996 when I did my first training.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, 96.
So I think mine was 97, 98.
But you would have been probably in the same conference
Yeah,
room
yeah.
and that. So I was combining neurolinguistic programming, behavioral psychology, elements of psychoanalytic theory, neuroscience to the field of self-defense and training guys, mainly guys. There was some women involved as well, for real-world violence, basically. And then got a reputation in that space for doing that. And it got to the point where so that started back in 2004. So it's 3 years after 9/11. So it was even like the Air Marshals would be on to me monthly. The chief instructor from the Air Marshals, which at that time was based in Las Vegas, would be on to me every month saying like, we need to do this, we need to do that. Because obviously if they're fighting on planes, they wanted them to be able to do as much as they could before pulling a sidearm and firing it because of the pressurized cabin. So they were very keen on unarmed combat and also the psychological preparation. Because for the 7 years after 9/11, there was 7, 8 years, people walking around going, this is going to happen again.
Yeah.
Any second
Yeah.
now, this is going off again.
Yeah.
So that it was a very, very heightened state. The special forces guys, the security forces, the London Riot Centre.
Yeah.
I was in communication with them all the time. All this just to say that like it was a big brand in that field, and that meant that I had access to guys all over the world who would be frontline operatives
Right.
who wanted to prepare themselves or their students or their employees for real world violence. And what kept happening was we would do like, adrenaline control and fear control and accessing states of aggression and control state, blah, blah, blah. And then at the end, they'd be like, so you do a bit of psychology, don't you? Yeah. So I need to ask you about my wife, or I need to ask you about my kids, or I need to ask you about this or about that. And I would be saying to them, like, you've got to go to therapy. There was an ex-SAS guy who couldn't sleep. He had such strong PTSD from the Yugoslavia war and the things that he'd experienced there, that he'd broken medical history. They were giving him drugs that should have knocked him out because he wasn't a big guy. And his adrenaline levels were so high that the only thing he could do, I think he told me, in order to get 2 hours of sleep, he'd have to do an 18-mile tab with 40 kilograms on his back and physically exhaust himself. Come back, he could get 2 hours, and then bang, his body would be awake again. And I was like, you have to, like, so guys like that, I'd say you have to go to therapy. I'm not going. Not sitting with a shrink. Not doing that. It's weird. I'll talk to you, though. And I'd be like, I'm just a bouncer from a nightclub. Why are you doing that? And so eventually I said, okay, so these guys don't want to do therapy, but they'll do life coaching.
Right.
So then it got called Spartan Life Coach. Spartan Life Coach was only really supposed to be there to help guys sort of gently introduce them to the idea of therapy, with a view on psychological self-defense and self-assertiveness, managing your own emotional states, processing trauma, that kind of thing, in a masculine, appealing way. And then it just got, like, once people found out I was doing that on YouTube, and we started talking about psychopathy and narcissism, that's where it just went, the psychopathy and narcissism route.
I mean, narcissism has become a bit of a buzzword now, though, hasn't it? I mean, everyone seems to be labelling everyone a narcissist.
Yeah, upstream of that, we psychologists and people like me who put psychology on YouTube, we're to blame for that. There's a particular term that I narcissistically believe I really popularized, which is trauma bonding.
Yeah.
Which was based on being asked about domestic violence. Did I ever tell you this? There was a woman who's the head. She was on CNN being interviewed, and the interviewer said to her, "Why do women keep going back to physically abusive men?" And she was the head for the whole of America, and she said, "We just don't know. There's no psychology research that indicates why that happens." So I was like, that's a crap answer.
Yeah.
So I started digging around and looking, and I went to cult psychology. So there's a particular area of psychotherapy that just deprograms people from cults. And they had it, it's trauma bonding. They had this term, trauma bonding. Released that video, that went viral. And then 2-3 years later, I'm hearing people say it back. I started to hear it back. But that, as an example, in the social media space, this is a process called psychologization. So more and more of our problems and more of our issues in society are viewed through a psychological lens, because people get a kick out of pretending to be psychiatrists, basically.
Do you think that's a good thing? Or do you
No,
think
I
it's
don't.
damaging?
I think it's a dreadful thing.
Why?
Well, it's false. You know, probably 90% of people who claim to be the victim of gaslighting, they're not victims of fucking gaslighting. Somebody lied to them. Or they're the victims of narcissists. No, the person you're dealing with is just a bit of a prick. And the other thing is, I don't think it's a very healthy thing for everybody to review all problems inside of a relationship through the lens of narcissism. So it's become this parlor game. I just have to figure out who the narcissist is. And it's either him, or it's me, or it's her, or it's me. And I'm like, well, maybe it's just not right for each other.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Because I've dealt with couples who are like, oh, this is definitely narcissism. And I'm sat there going, you don't even know what that is. I can show you a narcissist and this isn't it. I have somebody who's a bit indifferent, a bit self-centered. Sometimes they're on the spectrum.
Yeah.
They're just not particularly empathic. They're not reading social cues very well. He's a narcissist. It's like, no, he's not. It's not. Narcissistic personality disorder is a different thing. So no, I don't think psychologization is a good thing. The other thing is, obviously, I know you've got your son in schools. It's vile. Like, it's really poisonous to have kids view the world through a lens of something is wrong with me. I just have to figure out what it is. So you have this explosion, mostly in self-diagnosis, of ADHD, autism, dyslexia. And when I used to work in the schools up until 2009, I saw it coming. Every year that I worked, I did 5 years. Every single year I worked, it was getting worse and worse. It's just not. It's not the right way to look at reality.
I agree with you, actually. My son is dyslexic, and actually, getting that diagnosis was helpful because they teach him in a slightly different way now, and there's different things they can bring into the classroom that really help him and change, because he just learns in a different way. He's super intelligent, just got to teach him in a different way. And now, recently, there's been something about, maybe he's got ADHD, and I'm like, how does this help? Like, I'm all for you getting the right help. I'm all for if this is going to change something, like if it's going to give you extra time in exams. Or although it makes me laugh how you get extra time in exams when you've got ADHD and dyslexia. A 3-hour exam then becomes 3 hours, 3.5 hours. I mean, they lost attention after the first hour.
Yeah.
A break or a walk around session in the middle of the exam would be more helpful. Yeah. So I do find all that a bit confusing. I'm thinking, well, yeah, if it helps.
That's because education is a collapsing system, and so these are band-aids. It's a crap what we have is a really crap way of teaching kids. I worked in the education system for 5 years, and eventually I got booted out because it kept opening my big fat trap. They wanted me to work. I won't name the company that I worked for in Surrey, but they were working towards the end, because I got quite famous working in that space for what I was doing, because of the success that I had with the kids. And so I went from being a taxi driver to a keynote speaker at the National Education Conference in 2006, I think it was, next to Tony Bazan.
Wow,
The
love
guy,
Tony.
yeah,
I've met him.
And I was like, how's this happened? This is mad, you know. So, and so they said they wanted me to work for a project called Aim Higher, which I think is gone now. But they basically wanted me to go in schools and say to kids, go to university, you'll make more money. And I was like, that's not true. That's not true. There's a ton of crap degrees now. Like university is a money-making endeavour, and they're just churning out bad degrees with really, really severely lowered standards. Like the standards, this is not my opinion, it's an objective reality. The standards go down year by year just to push people through. So, inside the education system, what I would say is it's a collapsing endeavour. Nobody in education at any level, anywhere in the country, could answer a simple question. What is this for? What's education for? Do you want me to give you a factory worker? I'll do it. You want me to give you a wage slave? I'll do it. You want me to give you young philosopher kings and queens? I can do that. What do you want? Well, we've got to fulfill the standards of the blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, this is a fucking mess. This is a mess. All these different syllabuses clashing, all these competing groups. There's no adults in the room. It's like, what are we doing? What do you want them to be young entrepreneurs? Because if you do, so we have like wisps and bits and pieces of what we call classical education, which really isn't classical education at all, mixed in. It's a mess. It's a mess. And so I just said, I'm not dealing with this until you lot figure it out. I haven't got kids, but I don't know what I do with them, because I know how bad education is. I know how confusing it is for the kids as well.
I actually think that the academic is one thing, and it's, if you get good grades and you learn to study, there's certain skills that are beneficial for life in that, obviously.
For intellectuals. But we're not all intellectuals.
No, but it's the emotional intelligence that is, I find, lacking in education and school. And those sort of things, like dealing with difficult personalities, how to make friends. There's a strategy to how to make friends.
That's what I used to teach. I'd be like, how to make friends, how to be a good friend.
Yeah.
Your emotional intelligence, tuning into your own state, tuning into state management. Kids loved it.
Yeah.
Teachers loved it. Parents loved it. But just.
And I think, with my son, I've done obviously so much work with him, just learning, because emotional intelligence is what enables you to communicate better with people and work better with people. And I believe that, for me, especially, I was never the brightest at school or got the best grades. But if you can communicate with people and have an understanding, I think that's what takes you further in life.
For 100%. To the dyslexia point, I've got a cousin who was diagnosed clinically with dyslexia, and I was having a chat with him. He's about 10 years younger than me, and I tested him on different types of text. And when he read a men's magazine, FHM, versus reading a text on physics, he said the FHM made his dyslexia go away. And I said, I think you're fucking bored.
Yes.
I don't think you have dyslexia. I think you find this boring. And I don't think it's reasonable to sit, I don't know how old your son was when he was diagnosed, but to sit a 14-year-old young man down on a really uncomfortable chair and say, sit there for 40 minutes while a depressed, middle-aged failure of a human who hates his or her own life drones through something that they don't want to do. And you just sit there and take notes and listen to it. No disrespect to the teachers of this country. Some of them are wonderful people, but they're broken. A lot of them are broken. They're like social workers. They're just crushed by the system, and they're not allowed to teach. And their responsibilities, even back in 2009, were growing ridiculously. They'd come to me and they'd be like, I'm not just a teacher now. I have to be a police officer. I have to be a life coach. I have to be a nutritionalist. I was like, this is nonsense. This is just absolute nonsense. Let these poor people teach. But all that just to say, I wouldn't expect a 12-year-old boy to just sit there and listen about the gross national product of Guatemala and to faithfully write it. What for?
Well, it's funny because my son, this is the conversations I've literally been having with him, because he says, my teacher thinks I might have ADHD. That upsets me that she's gone to him and mentioned this rather than direct to me.
How old is he now?
He's 15.
Yeah.
And I said, well, okay, why? He said, because in physics and in, I think it was maths, I just go into this daydream state. And I said, well, does that happen?
It's so boring.
Does it happen in art? No. Does it happen in design technology? No. I'm like, I don't think you can have ADHD specific to certain topics.
You know what? I want to take every single adult who lets these kids be diagnosed, and then I want to put them through the classroom experience again.
Yeah.
There's 3 adults in this room right now. Mm-hmm. I tell you, it's torture. It's absolute torture. It's so boring. It's so uncomfortable. And you're just like, well, why aren't you just sat there absorbing all this fascinating information I'm giving you? Could it be that you're a crap teacher? Are you actually failing to teach? No, you must have a mental illness, child. Okay. The other thing that annoys me, and I won't bang on about it too much, we've got an obesity crisis.
Yeah.
Is it wise for the first 18 years of a child's life to say, sit there and shut up and keep still? It's like this trauma bonding thing. These poor kids who are full of life and full of energy are like that. And writing.
Yeah.
Just listen to me speak and write it down and remember everything I'm saying. It's boring. Why are we doing that? Then they go home and they want to play video games and they slouch there on their phone. You're like, go outside and play ball. Well, which one is it? Sit down, shut up and sit still. Or go out and play. Make your mind up, because they're kids.
Yeah.
They're just small humans. They can be entrained either way, but we have to choose. We have to decide, what is this for? Where I got traction in the education system, and I really shut up about this, was I was saying, look, there are different kids that need different training styles. And my proposition is, and then I put forward my proposition, and they need to be streamed.
Yeah, I agree.
Because it's not fair to, like, that potential young footballer is amazing footballer is a crap nuclear physicist. Mm-hmm. Similarly, you take this girl who could be an amazing nuclear engineer, nuclear physicist, and try and force her to play football. She sucks at football. Why force them?
Yeah.
Try and find educare, the original Latin meaning of educare, meant not shove information into a sock. Treat a human being like a sock. It meant draw forth. What is within you should be drawn forth from within you. It's your job as teachers to find out or the education system, find out what is inside of the child and bring it forth. Otherwise, what are we doing? It's like psychological butchery.
Yeah, because then they become, they believe they're not very good at certain things, and it damages their confidence, and then we get mental health consequences. Although, there's a whole shift these days towards children saying they've got,
because it's incentivized. But sorry to cut you off. The system is corrupt and it's dishonest, and then the children are mirroring that and going, well, she's saying that she's got ADHD and she gets 15 minutes extra on her exam, and he's saying he's got dyslexia and he gets an assistant through his exam. Well, why? What's the incentive? Yeah. Their children. Incentivize them, and they'll
totally
do
agree.
these things.
Okay, so let's get back to narcissism.
Narcissism and the intrinsic narcissism of forcing kids to do stuff they don't want to do.
Exactly. So a lot of my listeners...
I just remembered my passion for the education system. It's
I love it, though.
Lain dormant for the last 14 years.
And I'm totally in agreement with you on all of those points. What would you expect if you're in a relationship with a narcissist? What sort of things would be happening?
Well, one way that the target might awaken to the possibility that they're in an emotionally abusive relationship, let's say, is they frequently feel very confused, and then they're probably going online and asking questions of Google like, why is my boyfriend so cruel, or why doesn't my girlfriend listen to me when I tell her that I don't like it when she does this and that? So there's a lot of confusion that's created, and a lot that which triggers intrigue and inquiry, which then unfortunately further down the relationship trajectory actually stops people from leaving and keeps them focused on the abusive person as well.
How so?
Because we like to read the last chapter of the book that we're so invested in, and we find the last chapter is torn out. And so that keeps you obsessed, the intrigue. Like, why did this happen? Why did they do this? They seemed to be this, but actually it turns out they were that. I better go back and review what the signals and the evidence was. I must have missed something along the way. So it keeps people in a sort of an obsession spiral, unfortunately. But those are the first indicators that, yes, you could be at least in an emotionally abusive relationship, that you are confused.
Yeah, I've certainly experienced a lot of confusion in certain relationships. Can you tell before you get into the relationship in that dating period? Are there red flags that you can spot, do you think?
It depends on how much of a ditz you are. How ditzy are you? Like, I'm very ditzy. So in the initial phases of dating, if we date like adolescents, then no, you're not going to see any red flags, because you're probably somewhat addicted to love itself. You love being in love, and you love the process of, they call this limerence. And now we learned a new term, which was the object, the limerent object, which Mr. Mark Vicente taught us this weekend.
Explain for people who weren't there.
Yeah, so you can. So limerence is a sort of an altered state that the mind can go into, where you objectify the person. It's usually tinged with melancholy as well, a sadness. It's not about admiration, love, and respect. It's for its own sake. It's a sort of an emotional pornography. You're doing it for its own sake. So you're sort of absorbing the person as a drug. A limerent object means that you're focusing this emotion, this psychological and emotional state, on a person as an object to be used, a sort of an emotional dildo, if you will. You're no longer respecting the person as a person. You're saying, I need you to be this, so that I can get my drug, so that I can get my fix. So if you're ditzy in that way, then you won't. There could be as many red flags as you like. They could shroud themselves in a red flag from head to foot.
Because you don't want to see it, do we? I think also.
If you're ditzy.
I mean, am I ditzy? Yeah, well, clearly then the definition of ditzy is me, because I've done it several times.
If you're emotionally immature, and there can be like attachment issues there, and it can be. Maybe, I don't know, if you have an extreme sense of loneliness and you're desperate to connect with another human being.
For a lot of women, when you hit 30, there's that tick-tock going on. So you just assume that you are now ready for the person that's going to be the rest of your life person. So you kind of go through dating in your 20s and you just have fun. You think, right, well, this is all a bit of fun. Looking for the right person, but you're not really freaking out about it until you get to about 30. 30, then you start thinking, right, next person is the person that I should marry. And that becomes, I think, a bit more of a driving force for us women who want kids, because we know that by the time you start dating and you get into a relationship and then you get pregnant, 34, I got pregnant, and I was termed geriatric as far as pregnant women.
It's a geriatric pregnancy, isn't it, beyond at that age?
Yeah. Which I was like, what? But that's how it is, right? And there's a lot of, more information, I think, for women now, because we were delaying having kids. So, it's
when should women have children?
Well, whenever they want them, I think. It's probably,
no, but when's the biological optimal, the medical?
I think in your 20s is
that's pre-geriatric.
Well, because our eggs just diminish over time. So, the
sperm does too. I think a lot of men think that they can get away with it until the age of 70, but what Ed Dutton was saying over the weekend is past the age of 35, your mutational load is massively going up. Yeah, men can't just... I was told this when I was 41. I went to a fertility clinic and they were like, they're moving slow and they're moving in strange directions. And here's a list of consequences to your children should you choose to breed. And I'll be like, oh dear, that's not very good. Yeah. So men should know as well, like it's not, we don't get a free ride.
Well, I mean, men go through the menopause as well. It's just called the andropause, isn't it? It's not as well talked about, but it, in my experience, tends to involve a Lamborghini and a younger woman. But for women, it's slightly different. But I think, I think for a lot of women at that point, the next partner...
I like young women. I couldn't eat a whole one.
I think when you get to that point, though, as a woman, you're sort of maybe your filtering of those red flags is diminished because of that as well. It's not just being ditzy. It's a case of, right, I need to reproduce. I want to have a family.
You might not be a ditz. You might not be emotionally immature. It's probably a better way of saying it than saying you're ditzy. It's like, I'm ditzy, or emotionally immature is probably a less persecutory way of saying it. And delusional, like there's a lot of cultural conditioning around love and romance that is just not helpful.
Like what?
Somebody's going to rescue you.
Yeah.
Somebody's going to make everything okay.
Yeah.
They're not.
And that's the fairy tale ending that narcissism brings to an abrupt halt.
Now, where are we most invested in fairy tales? Usually around the age of 3 and 4. That's when they're read to us. So that seems like a rather cruel thing to do to a child.
And Disney, all the way up,
All the way up.
Yeah.
Every Disney movie is full of sickness and perversion. So we're not really creating young philosopher kings and queens, are we?
No.
No,
Richard, we're not.
we're not. And we're also not prioritizing human dignity, emotional maturity, agency, and sovereignty, because we're actually trying to create little consumers. I won't go off on another one of my rants, but the coordinates of our culture is are narcissistic and psychopathic, and that's why these things happen. So we're basically preparing people for victimization in a certain sense. Because look, even if the guy, say if I'm a 35-year-old woman and I have been through different relationships in my 20s, and now I'm like, I want to get married, I want to have kids, and I'm under time pressure, and I make do, and the guy isn't right for me. And here's a controversial idea. Most people aren't right for you in a relationship. There's a numbers game here. It's just unreasonable to think you can take anyone and then it's going to be wonderful for the next 6 decades of your life. For 5 decades. It's not reasonable. And so if the guy or the girl isn't right for the guy or the girl in question, that can lead to a lot of problems in a relationship with no pathology whatsoever. And then you will feel very disappointed. You know, you'll feel like, well, I was lied to. I was promised something that wasn't delivered. And then I would say, who lied to you? Did the woman lie to you? Did you lie to yourself? Did your cultural conditioning lie to you? What was promised? Did you express that verbally? Did you write it down? Did you sign a contract for it or not? And these are a lot of things that we just don't do in our culture. We play with fire. And then everybody gets their little pinkies burned and it's like, ow, why did that happen? Well, you're playing with fire. Sex and romance are not. We treat them as games in our culture. They're really not. It can make you very, very miserable. Look at the understanding going on. Yes.
Well,
great wisdom has been dropped.
It has, as always, with you, Richard, I think. I mean, looking back.
Look, I'm 46 and single. Nobody should listen to anything that I say. I'm single, which means I have an awful lot of time to think about this stuff. An awful lot of time to think about why I'm single.
If you are struggling with a breakup, divorce, or domestic abuse, then you're not alone. Do reach out. You can try our online support groups for free for a week to get some support from my accredited coaches, and also find your tribe, or come and get some one-to-one coaching with one of my coaches too. So you can find more information about that on my website, saradavison.com. You're in a relationship with a narcissist. It's not going well. Can you fix them? Can you help them? Or is that just
Yes, just love them more, give them more, do whatever they say, and things will get better in a couple of weeks.
Do not try this at home.
No, if somebody has narcissistic personality disorder, there's really nothing that you can do for them as a partner. If somebody has very, very narcissistic traits, or it's just a human being who does not want to listen, they just rigidly want to do what they want to do, then abandon all hope. Just leave them and find someone else. There's an awful lot of humans out there.
Yeah, it's hard when you have kids.
Yeah.
And financially you're tied in, maybe.
Yeah.
And then you've had all the narcissistic conditioning that you're useless and you won't be able to cope on your own, and no one will ever love you again.
Yeah. So I go back. Romance is not a game. Sex is not a game. Playing mummies and daddies and playing house is not a game, but we treat it like it is. There are consequences to sex and romance, like the production of other humans. Got to be careful.
Yes, and you're in it and you're there. So hindsight being a wonderful thing.
Haven't got a time machine.
What do I do, Richard? How does this impact children? Let's go there.
Well, it ain't great. it's less than ideal. If you've got one parent who's a lunatic, who's and is maniacally selfish, that's not it's not good parenting material.
Definitely not good parenting material. How can you help your kids in those scenarios? Is there hope for them? Can they? I mean, I know what I believe. I want to hear your thoughts.
Hope for the children?
Yeah.
Oh, no, yeah, of course, they'll be fine. They will, like, you know, children
Will they become like that parent often, or do you think they can learn?
They could do. I mean, obviously, in most cases, my sister's going through this right now, the other parent legally has access to the children. But... you know, if you can keep yourself emotionally regulated and live life as a decent human being, and they have a sane role model versus an insane role model, they'll probably do what the sane role model is doing because their life is more fun and cooler. Kids care about like coolness and fun and power, so they'll more likely to follow the parent who has more agency and is having a better time.
But a lot of times, especially with the kind of clients I work with, they have a lot of money. So the cool and the fun comes from the expensive holidays, the fast cars, the gadgets, the toys.
Not if they're mentally ill. It's really, really hard for kids to be around mentally ill people. They're not stupid. Daddy's rich, mummy's very rich, but she's a twat. You know, it's hard to talk to her. It's hard to be around her. I feel like I'm walking on eggshells. No, give me the poor but fun parent.
Is there a gender bias, do you think, narcissistic?
In our culture?
It just...
What?
Well, domestic abuse is predominantly, it is a gender-specific issue. You know, it's around 80% female. It doesn't say it doesn't happen to men. It definitely does, and I work with them.
80% female. 80% of women are battering their husbands, you say?
The other way around. So, you know, 80% of victims tend to be
Reported. A lot of men don't report.
And a lot of women don't report.
Yeah.
So, I think...
You think it's 80%?
I mean, I work with men, and it is about the 80-20 split. Okay. And I agree, there's a lot of women that don't report things and don't come forward, as well as men not reporting. You know, I do think it is more
Proceed to your
female.
question.
Just riled me there for a moment. It's the pushback from the society
I've been hit by women, but I didn't report it.
Yeah.
Because it's embarrassing.
I could totally see that it's embarrassing for men to report things.
But I also wasn't afraid for my life either. Whereas if I was being hit by somebody who was 30% heavier than me,
well, isn't that the...
Then I would be in fear for my life.
Yeah.
Anyway.
I can't remember what my question was now because you just...
Triggered you into an emotional flashback.
Yeah.
It is a gendered problem. Men are heavier and stronger than women. So the greater threat of death and permanent life-changing injuries is from men to women. There is a lot of domestic violence that goes from women. And the group that has the most domestic violence between men and women, and women is women and women. The highest level of domestic violence is between lesbian couples, by far. But then maybe that's because you can, you know, maybe. And also when I've spoken to I have a lesbian couple who I've been friends with for about 15 years. They're from here. Well, not one's from Mexico, one's from China, but I met them here. They said there's an awful lot of mate guarding in of female gay relationships. Like if you finally you get your girlfriend, they get very, very jealous. That was what I was told.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It's an interesting subject, but we're not here to discuss domestic violence. Please.
No, not today. Mind you, it definitely comes into narcissistic abuse as part of
Well, that's where the crossover was between Street Fight Secrets and the Self-Defense Project, and then the psychological self-defense was like, who's doing this? Who's doing this? Narcissistic psychopaths do this. There's a particular type of narcissist who engages in more domestic violence.
Oh, really?
Yes, the vulnerable narcissist.
Tell
The
me more.
vulnerable, covert narcissist who has more shame about their narcissism is more likely to engage in domestic violence against us, and it's usually male, female. So it's male vulnerable narcissists are more likely to abuse a female partner, children, and animals. Yeah, so the grandiose narcissist who's like, I'm great and the world agrees with me, they actually are not particularly prone to any violence in any context. The vulnerable narcissist who has a lot of shame around their narcissistic delusion, they can become quite violent. Well, they're significantly more violent than the grandiose narcissist.
How many types of narcissists are there?
As many types as psychologists can write books. I mean, if it's the DSM, there's really only one. I tend to think these are probably all strategies. So people say, oh, there's a very sexual narcissist or there's a very intellectual narcissist. And I would say, well, for me, it's all a form of, first of all, it's all downstream of psychopathy. This is all psychopathy to me. This is
Right.
not the orthodoxy. And then we're describing strategies.
Yeah.
Like a vulnerable narcissist is vulnerable because they can't afford to be grandiose, because they're not pretty, they're not clever, they're
Right.
not wealthy. And so they have these fantasies, but then their brain is kicking off going, but nobody really likes you. I think I'm really sexy. Well, that's great, but no one agrees. So, so that's and that anxiety could be the thing that's triggering more narcissistic rage, which leads to more violence.
I get asked this a lot, I'm sure you do. So I'm interested to hear your answer to this question. Do they know what they're doing?
Do any of us?
Answer the question. Mr. Grannon.
Well, but the question assumes that like the average human being has agency and is sat there making rational decisions about how they live their lives. But you've been in narcissistic abusive relationships. I've been in narcissistic abusive relationships. You are not a moron. I am not an idiot. And yet I did that anyway, which would suggest that a lot of us are operating from unconscious drives, and they for sure are operating from unconscious drives. Do they know it's wrong? And do they know when they're being provocative? And
Cool.
yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
For sure. But the core elements by which they operate, that's just the core elements from which they operate. These are unconscious drivers.
So, yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the difficult things. There was someone asking the question, should I have sympathy for my narcissistic partner at the weekend?
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
Well, I think you were right, and I think Ed was right.
Because we disagreed. Sort of.
Yeah, sort of, but then Ed came round to your point of view.
Explain for those, obviously, that weren't there.
So a woman asks in a seminar on narcissism, should I have sympathy for my ex-husband? Sara, the divorce coach, whose role is in helping men and women from getting out of these abusive relationships, says absolutely not. Ed Dutton, Professor Ed Dutton, the academic, says, well, why not? Why shouldn't you have sympathy for somebody who has a mental health issue? And I interjected and said, well, it's context specific. You have a coach versus an academic. And of course, an academic can afford to have sympathy because there's no cost. It's not high risk. And theoretically, yes, it's a mental health issue. They were all children once. And had they been raised in a different environment, it's highly likely they wouldn't be that way. But you know, as I know, as Ed doesn't know, when you're coaching die-hard codependents, any sliver of hope that they can take that their partner could recover or get better could cost them years, if not decades of their lives waiting in endless hope.
Yeah. So if they felt sorry, they could go back and maybe fix it, help them, support them,
So
and
we
in
have
other words, enable it.
So we have a dogmatic. Our response is dogmatic. I mean, it's not truthful. It's a functional dogma, which is no, you can't afford sympathy. Don't be sympathetic. It's not your job. This therapist that they hire, which they'll never hire, can be sympathetic.
It's not truthful. What do you mean by that?
Well, like if you look at it from a truthful point of view, Should a human being feel compassion and sympathy for another human being suffering from a mental health issue? Yes.
Well, that's a very nuanced way of saying if it's someone that you could phrase it as someone that's torturing you, being continuously cruel, and causing you severe emotional harm.
Yeah.
Should you feel sympathetic for them? So that's how you frame the question.
Everything is context specific.
Yeah.
Everything is context specific. So, but if you look, when I say truthful, if you look at it from a purely objective stance, yes, human beings should feel sympathy and compassion for other human beings who suffer. But in this context, no, shoot the enemy.
Okay, maybe don't try that at home.
But don't literally do that. But if you were in a wartime situation and you're being invaded and you said, "Oh my God, these poor boys, they're just conscripts, they're working class like I am, blah blah blah," yeah, very good. However, they will kill, torture, blah 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 blah, blah and everything else that people do in war. You better shoot them.
Self-preservation, I guess, isn't it?
Yeah. But we're in the realms of philosophy now. But it's worth just expanding it out and saying, well, why? You offered a dogmatic response, and it's the same dogmatic response I offer. I can't afford my clients to think that there's a space, any compassion, any sympathy, any hope whatsoever. We can't afford it. So we say no. We just say no. But it doesn't mean it's the most, it's the expression of the highest level truth.
Okay. So we get out of the relationship eventually, hopefully.
Inshallah.
And then we do it again. Why?
Ditzy.
I'm not proving ditzy, Richard.
Well, I'm saying I am as well. I put us both in the ditzy dinghy.
No, I know. I'm like we do though. We repeat the same relationship, even though it took us so long to get out, and we're glad we're out, and we celebrate we're out, and we heal. Or do we? Is that why we're going back in?
That's why we go back in. It's a fantasy. So whatever fantasy existed, I believe for people who get back into narcissistically abusive relationships, so I'd say, therefore, you qualify as a codependent, which is a subclinical term. By my definition of codependency, a cult of one, the book I wrote, is to help people who I've defined as being like me, who have something called echo codependency. Echo was the nymph, Narcissus was the beautiful Greek boy, the beautiful Greek hunter that we name for narcissistic personality disorder. But the person who was in love with him was a nymph. So he was toxically expressed yang, who's a beautiful man who loved himself. And the nymph is in this story, Echo, is the toxically stock yin. We are receivers, we're receptive. That's our fantasy. That's that's their fantasy and our fantasy. And our pathological fantasies interlock. Until you resolve the fantasy, no, you'll just go back and do it again. So, ditzy.
So, thanks. How do we heal from being ditzy then, Richard?
You've got to emotionally mature past fantasy. Like you've got to just say this fantasy is never going to be realized. Or you could choose a better fantasy, which is reasonable. You know, in transactional analysis, they'd say you never really wake up from games. You're always going to be playing games. You can just choose better games to play, which I think is fine. But a better fantasy is more reasonable.
So getting educated on what it is.
Therapy's good. Therapy's
So
really
you're
good.
an advocate of therapy.
Yeah.
I'm an advocate for coaching.
Yeah.
Why the therapy?
You need insight into the spaces that currently sit in darkness. Coaching can't do that. I like coaching as well. I think you should do 50-50. It should be yin and yang. Therapy is yin, coaching is yang. But no, you need something that brings light to the darkness.
Obviously, you've got to pick a good therapist to be able to go on that journey.
Oh yeah, there's loads of crap therapists.
Yeah.
There's loads of them.
Should we not go on that topic?
There's fucking loads of them. No,
we can both be here for a long time. The question that I get asked a lot, I'd love to hear your answer is, can you ever win an argument with a narcissist?
Well, not to them. Not in their world. I mean, in reality, I've won loads of arguments with narcissists. It didn't do me any good. I was ultimately right and ultimately more factually correct, but didn't do anything. It's not like they went, "Oh yeah, you're right." "Oh, yes, you're quite right. Yes, well done. I was wrong. Sorry about that." Sorry about that. I actually watched somebody who's a friend of mine from childhood sort of develop a sort of a late stage narcissism. And I was thinking about him just yesterday because I was walking through Liverpool at a place that I'd been with him a long time ago. And I actually remember the last time he apologized for being wrong. It was a very strange experience. And then we were both 26. And then after that, he just never, ever apologized to me ever again.
So can it get worse over time? Was he always a narcissist and just flared up, or?
He'd had a very, very strange childhood. He was raised in a very strict Muslim household, but then he was out with me at weekends. You know, he was under a lot of pressure, and he'd experienced some sexual abuse in childhood as well, which had split him. And he just couldn't. He was very, very split. So he was in a very, like where I'm from in the world is a very, very white. It's 99% white, and he was in a very white, very sort of English culture, but whether his father was there, he wasn't the head of the local mosque, but he was he was on the council that represents like the whole of the North England so it was very, very hard for him, and he split. He went mad. I watched him go insane trying to be two people at the same time. Yeah. So that was one case where I'd say, no, that wasn't in childhood. That was something that I think came about through his adolescence experiences and his experiences at university. And then it sort of slowly took him. And then it was actually my sister that pointed it out, because she knows him very well. By the time he'd got to 30, she was like, there's some sort of a light that's gone out in him. He just became a very dark person. Yeah, very, very joyless.
Yeah.
Very joyless after that.
I do like your explanation of splitting, because I see that with children, that when they're with the narcissistic parent, if they're divorced, they have to be a certain person around them. It's not their true, authentic self. Not that I like that phrase, but they're not being themselves. They're not free to just be them, which as a kid is quite difficult. And what I found is quite often the kids are very uncomfortable when the two parents come together, even if they're, able to maintain an amicable dialogue in those moments. It's because the child is struggling, because with one parent he's somebody different, and then that child is their true self with the other parent. So bringing those parents together and existing in that space highlights that split for the child unconsciously, but they struggle with that. Yeah,
it's very hard. It's very, very hard, and it's unfortunately it's a defense that would be on the spectrum as a narcissistic defense.
Yeah.
In the same way that codependency is a kind of a narcissistic defense. But it's a pronounced fawn response. What else can they do? They have to survive.
Yeah.
Psychologically, they have to survive the other parent.
It's a survival coping mechanism.
It's a survival coping mechanism. But at least they could, if they have a healthy parent, as I said before, with whom they can take refuge, with whom they can be their authentic selves, then they'll be okay. They'll be okay.
Yeah, no, and it's just interesting for people who are in that situation when they don't understand, because I know a lot of legal professionals may be saying, spend time together, still do the family things, and the children can be a little bit resistant to that. That could be why, and usually is why, because being with both parents means they have to show one of the other parents that they're not really themselves. So it's a very difficult position, especially for a young child who doesn't understand exactly why it's so uncomfortable.
Yeah, I'd not thought of that. But yeah, that makes sense to me. Then there's a big stress for the child to perform, as they have to show two different faces at the same time.
Yeah. Which actually, on sports days, parents' evenings, things like that, is quite often why it's so difficult for the kids.
Yeah.
And why we need this level of understanding, and the lawyers, don't always understand these levels, which causes problems.
Yeah.
Another question I get asked a lot: how do you stop the narcissist obsessing about you when you're no longer with them?
Be as boring as you can. So that's not. It's attributed to me because I think I popularised it, but it's not my idea. It's called the grey rock technique, and it was already there on YouTube. It's just my video got more views than hers did, I think. The grey rock technique was to consciously try to cut off all sorts of supply in terms of drama or feedback, and to just become a very, very boring object. By being grey rock, they'll lose interest in you. was one way. If they're obsessed, it could potentially be because the client cut them off. They weren't allowed to discard the client, which is what their fantasy is.
Yeah.
When I'm saying fantasy here, I'm meaning it in the psychoanalytic theory way. It doesn't necessarily mean this is something you want to have happen, and it doesn't necessarily have a sexual component to it. It's the way our minds imagine a thing will go and need it to go. That's what when I'm saying fantasy, I'm using it like that. So if the client cuts off the narcissist before the narcissist does the cutting off and the discarding, that can create obsession.
Yeah, makes sense. Can you ever be free?
Of their interest in you? Oh yeah, they should move on. I mean, it's an infantile disorder. They have very, very low impulse control. They're very, very stimulation seeking. And so if they're not getting it from you, they'll start to go into narcissistic depletion, which to them feels like death. Nobody's reinforcing their grandiose delusional fantasy. They've got to find someone else to do it.
So there's hope.
They'll leave you alone, for sure. For sure, yeah. They should leave you alone eventually, yeah.
Fantastic. Okay. Where can people find you, Richard, if they want to follow you?
In a farmhouse in Portugal. No, so my YouTube channel is just called Richard Grannon, and I have information about narcissistic abuse and recovery there.
And it's very good, so I suggest everyone goes and checks it out.
It is. It's wonderful. It's brilliant. It's funny. It's charming.
Well, to be honest, I think the internet can be a toxic cesspit for a source of information on a lot of these topics, which actually helps people get stuck in that unhealthy cycle when you're learning about things. So the only person I ever recommend people to go check out on the internet is you.
Good. Quite right. I'm
on this
the best.
topic, of course. Not everything. God, no. That would be worrying. Okay. My final question is one I asked all my guests. Podcast is called Heartbreak to Happiness. So what is happiness for you, Richard?
Peace. Just peace. Usually being in nature. A very, very low stimulus environment, maybe some birds singing. If I could see something natural, get some sunshine, see the trees, see a mountain, see the sea, then I feel calm and I'm not in any pain, I'm not agitated, I would say that's a moment of happiness.
I love it. Well, thank you so much for being, as always, a phenomenal guest.
Thank you very much for having me. Cheers.
So if you are struggling with any kind of breakup, divorce, domestic abuse, then do check out our online support groups that we offer, as well as our one-to-one coaching and our toxic relationship recovery retreats. You can find those on my website, saradavidson.com. And thank you for tuning in today. If you enjoyed this episode, then please do click the subscribe button because it really helps us to improve the podcast every single time. Today's episode is sponsored by Hunters, a firm of solicitors in central London, specialising in all aspects of family law, because having a supportive family law team by your side makes all the difference when you're making some of these significant decisions in your life. You can contact them by emailing olivia.piercy@hunterslaw.com and quoting Sara Davidson. Don't forget to subscribe, and I look forward to you joining me on our next episode.
That's it for today's episode of Heartbreak to Happiness. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review to win a free ticket to one of Sara's virtual retreats. The retreats are a transformative combination of live webinars with Sara herself, coupled with empowering online video programs designed to help you cope better with your breakup and start feeling happy again. For more details, head on over to heartbreaktohappinesspodcast.com, where you can also get a copy of Sara's free gift. Thank you, and join us again on the next episode for another dose of Heartbreak to Happiness.